Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and we have the freshest, the hottest summer updates. GW figured out a long time ago that summer is the season when we play a lot less and we buy a lot more. The first thing, we got this really sweet update for Warcry at the not 40k preview. Pretty sweet. I have a lot of feelings about Kruleboys. I like Kruleboys. I don't love them, but I like them. I have a lot of them painted, actually. The whole setting, the AOS setting, needs orcs that aren't Iron Jaws. Iron Jaws are awesome. I have a ton of Iron Jaws. I'm going to play Iron Jaws in a tournament in 2 weeks. I'm really excited about them. But they're like a very specific kind of vibe to them. And that's not all that orcs are, in my opinion. I mean, orcs are a little bit like elves in the way elves are treated in AOS of just having, you have your sea elves, you have your high elves, you have your snake elves, and you have, examples and ideas about so many more elves that are in the setting. I mean, when do we get our uh, weird satyr elves? When do we get our shadow demon elves? Things like that. I think you can do the same for orcs. So I love that they're kind of experimenting with what else can an orc be, but I don't know that they completely hit it with Kruleboys, and maybe more people would feel like they had if the essence on the tabletop had worked a little better. They have this issue where in AOS they've been completely unplayable since they started, and in Warcry they're really cool, but the problem is they can't do their shtick, which is monsters, which is like they're riding monsters all over the place and they accompany monsters into battle and all of that stuff. Well, here's a legitimate attempt to do that, and I think that's really cool. So we've got these little Warcry sized monsters, which are these little monkeys. I would have actually preferred they went with something bigger than a monkey. If they had maybe combined those two monkeys into one bigger thing, or maybe just done one bigger thing and then like another egg grot. But the monkeys themselves are pretty sweet. I really really like the one that's kind of on the tree. I don't normally like those types of. I don't like playing with them, to be honest, because it just feels so silly that they're like bringing this piece of terrain around them on the battlefield. I just can't get over that. I know it's silly, but for like display and just looking at it, I think that monkey looks amazing. The other one is a little bit too like closed in. I don't love the hunch of him. That's just me. Now, a model that is hunched that does work for me really well is this incredible Clutch a Grot. I love Egg Grot. I would do anything for Egg Grot. Unfortunately, I think the point of him in this warband is just to get killed and die, but he's really, really sweet. The rest of them are fine. I'll be honest, when I see a model like this Beast Knob, I mostly just think about how little I want to paint it. There's just a lot of tiny details. There's things like this little crotch nubbin stuff is behind a bunch of stuff that's stopping you from getting in there with a paintbrush very easily. It's not like every time I talk on the video about how something is going to be really hard to paint, there's always someone with a lot more experience painting than me who tells you how easy it is. But it's not like easy. Let's be real here. So this guy, I think he's got too much going on. He's visually very busy for me. Now, this is the kind of thing where sometimes these types of models, when you spin them 360, they look way better than they look in a picture. Like, we don't really know what that backpack looks like from the side, and I think that's going to be really important. For example, in the preview video, now I think this drummer boy looks incredible. I love the drummer. I love the scars. I love the crazy fin that's on his little sling here. I love, that he is a drummer. I can't wait to see what his ability is. But a thing that you can't tell with him is that this drum is actually massive and it goes back, and it's almost like a huge tail on his miniature. So when you see his miniature, like they showed kind of the camera swooping around him a little bit, he looks incredible, and you would not be able to tell from that picture how striking he really is. I'm wondering if maybe the Beast Knob is a little bit more striking once you see him actually on the table. But at the moment, it's not really doing it for me. Even though I know they're doing a lot of like composition stuff that you're supposed to do, right? It's like it's very triangular with his head in the center. Like that's like a art school sculpture lesson that you see in a lot of GW centerpieces as they're trying to create these triangles because triangles move your eye around the miniature, etc. It's still not working for me, even though it's got all of those art school flourishes to it. So maybe when I see it actually kind of turning around in my hand, I'll like it because I probably will get this warband because, like I said before, I've got a ton of Kruleboys painted already, so it'd be almost kind of silly not to. Now I've got a big painting backlog, so I won't be getting it right away, but I will be getting it eventually. As far as the other little guys, I think they're cool. I kind of like skull helmets. I think that's fun. I like that there's kind of a lot of skin showing. I like orcs. You know, if it's not going to be Iron Jaws with armor everywhere, I want my orcs to be very orky and let me show off. Like, here's how I want to try to paint orc flesh. Orc flesh is really fun. Every single painter has their own kind of uh, spin on it, and you can take it a bunch of different really cool ways. And so I can't wait to see kind of what people do with this. Although you know they're somewhat replacement level as just guys, but that's fine. Now there's another kind of update that tends to happen in the summer, and that is a little type of update called a balance update. And I thought this was really interesting. I had been planning this video before we saw the preview because there's really these, games get updated in a few different ways. And we've gotten a really cool, roadmap for how Warcry is going to be updated. We've got all these regular updates happening. Warcry is being supported like a real game, which is really awesome. But it's not being balanced like a game that they think people are actually playing a lot, right? I think it's being balanced like a game that I think they think people get together and maybe get one or two games a month in. And I think for most of the player base, that's probably true. But for a lot of folks, that's not true. And for a lot of folks, you hear about the people who are playing a lot, and that informs the lists you make so that in your one or two games a month, a lot of the time your lists will be, influenced by what you know is good. And that can make it so that it feels even in your not very many games a month meta that the real competitive meta still exists to you. It still has some influence on your tabletop. And so these sort of balance updates that we see, the games that have them more often, there's a lot of gnashing of teeth over how often it happens. And I just think it's really interesting that all three games that are bigger than Warcry, which, it's fine, you got to draw a line somewhere. Horus Heresy, I guess, is bigger than Warcry 2, but it's also weird in its own sort of way, and I'm not going to go into that here. But Kill Team got a balanced data slate. AOS gets a whole General's Handbook. And of course, there's the mess that's happening in 40K. I wanted to think about how, do I actually want a balance update for Warcry? And by that I mean, we want balance in our game, right? This is a pretty common comment on my videos, a pretty common thing that you'll see posted online on the Facebook, on the Reddit, on the Discord, is like people talking about, I can't believe, GW doesn't give this game any respect. They never balance it, whatever. Because we want to feel that balance there, right? Or at least we want to have a game where the imbalances in the game create fun gameplay. And we also want it to be difficult to figure out what the best things are in the game. If we know really quickly what's the best thing in the game, it feels like a lot of the discovery has been stolen from us. And it can feel really cheap when you know what the strongest thing in the game is before you've gotten to play a lot of games, right? Because it's like other people took it from you, or other people could even just see based on the stats what was going to be the strongest thing in the game. That can really suck. So the balance that kind of can be out there can really affect your fun even when you're not necessarily tuning really competitively. Now, the question is, when do we want our balance? Because, of course, you know, figuring out what the best things are makes it so that formats or sort of current balance updates can be more and less fun at different stages of their development, right? Sometimes in a lot of these sort of living, evolving games, you can see a format that's really, really fun for a little while until some people figure out a couple approaches to it, and then it stops being fun really quick. That kind of raises this question of how often do we really want balance? And I think that's really complicated. I know a lot of AOS fans have been talking about how 6 month cycles is way too fast for them. And I think there's a lot to that that we can kind of continue to unpack as this video goes along. Now, what also constitutes a cycle or a balance pass is important to me. Like, how far do you go? And let's take a look at, for example, on January 31st, we got an FAQ. An FAQ isn't normally really considered a balance update, but that particular FAQ was a lot of changes that were pretty clearly based on player feedback, on mostly on power level stuff. There were sort of quality of life changes, but for the most part, the thing that people really felt was every monster went up 100 points, and a few of the sort of game dominating triples got way, way worse. That's a balance pass in a lot of ways. Now, it's a really light touch balance pass. It's funny because it's light touch in terms of the amount of things that changed, but it really changed what people can put in the game because so many monsters became almost impossible to fit into a warband. But I think that's really interesting as far as sort of how far they went and whether that's the kind of touch that we want or not. Because they have a few different options whenever they make a balance pass to a game or commit to how they want to update a game as it goes along, right? Because AOS's General's Handbooks, they're basically whole new editions in their own right. You know, I played an AOS tournament at Adepticon where the sort of battalions that you had at your disposal were completely different than they had been before and completely changed the game, right? The entire sort of basis around how you play the game completely changes. And so they change so many things at once that because they often will also change points with a general's handbook. And so they're changing so many things at once that even if points stayed the same, the meta would completely shift. There's no real reason when you put a new general's handbook out there, the players really have no reason to think that the meta is going to be any more balanced on the other side of this GHB than it was beforehand, which is a really odd way to balance a game, right? Where we're not going to balance it. We're just going to wildly imbalance it again and again every year. I think that, you know, AOS players complained a lot about the 6 month shift being really too fast to be able to, like, people were having to revamp lists, and it was like you either had the meta chasers or the people who were so chill that they just like were going to take the same ish list regardless of whether it was any good. And they could both kind of hang, but everyone in the middle, which was most of the people who go to events, were just like totally screwed because it's like you want to be tinkering with your list to make it a little bit better in the current GHB, but like you don't have necessarily the time or the resources to do that all the time. And 6 months was just really brutal for them, and I think a lot of them really hated it. I think they're going to get sick of 1 year in the same way because, again, these GHBs, they're solvable as almost any game is, right? That's not being updated that often. And I think the back half of these 6 month windows is going to have a lot of grumpy people, you know, not super happy with the game. Because these GHBs aren't very balanced. They haven't ever been, because they're not really designed to be, because they change so many things that it's impossible for GW to actually understand the implications of what they're changing, right? If that weren't true, right, the one where it was supposed to be all infantry meta, but the infantry hate battalion was just way better than any of the infantry battalion bonuses. And so, like, you just couldn't play infantry was what it became. That was wild because it was really clear from the get-go that they made this, infantry idea based on this is what people are going to play, and they just it had exactly the opposite effect on the meta, right? Because they don't understand, and they can't understand that. They just don't have a big enough development team. They can't understand the sort of third, fourth, and fifth dominoes that are going to fall when you change that many things. So that can be kind of rough, but it's also really exciting because so much changes that players have a whole new world to explore. So that can be really great. Whereas something like the Kill Team data slate, they changed a lot of quality of life things, kind of minor tweaks, but they're promising that these are going to keep occurring regularly, and they have occurred regularly. I think Kill Team has gotten this kind of stuff at a 6-month clip, but they might have missed a couple of those windows. But generally, it's meant to fix an existing meta. When I looked at their comments on it, now I don't play competitive Kill Team, but their comments were very much like, not enough players are playing this faction. Let's make it more attractive to play that faction. This faction is winning a little more than we'd like to. This faction is struggling in competitive play, but really overpowering in casual play. We're going to kind of make a change to fix both of those at the same time. It was very, very nuts and bolts, very sort of trying to basically live with the meta they have and to fix the meta they have. That is much better experimental design. If you want to actually have a balanced game, that is the only way to do it. But that doesn't always matter in game design, right? Because those GHBs, right, give people a whole new way to play the game, and that can be really exciting for folks. This Kill Team data slate is not giving anybody a new way to play the game, and they're just going to move a couple little factions up and down on the tier lists, and that's going to make an overall more enjoyable experience for everyone. Both of those are completely valid ways to do it, but I think it's worth thinking about for Warcry, which one do we actually want? And I think to kind of answer that question, it's really hard for GW to necessarily balance a game like Warcry because there's a real question, I think, as to how well we really know the meta. GW doesn't have as much knowledge about who's out there playing what, who's winning which tournaments, as people who watch my channel have, because I collect a lot of data that they don't bother to collect. It's not their job to, I mean, it kind of is their job to do it, but they don't do it, right? They don't canvas tournament organizers from various non-GW owned game stores. It's just kind of outside their purview. I don't think they're interested in hiring the 2 people it would take. Those are 2 full salaries. I don't think they're interested in doing that. So there's a question of how well do we, the community, know what the meta really is, and how well does GW know what it is? Because if you're going to make these kinds of tinkering nuts and bolts Kill Team data slate style changes, you have to be pretty confident that you know what's going on in the game. And for idiosyncratic packs, we know, I would say with 99% certainty, what's good. We know what is good in the core book. We know what is good in the Rumble Pack. For those who don't know, the Rumble Pack is a pack of missions where 5 of them are objective missions that all play the same way. And then one of them is a treasure mission that does play completely differently, to its credit. 5 of those 6, I think, are really good missions on their own. It's just as a group, it's an incredibly idiosyncratic pack. It all favors one type of warband, and so there's really only, in my opinion, 4 factions that can truly compete in it. And I think that they're sort of really head and shoulders above the rest of the meta. Now, if you really know what you're doing, you can make a warband in at least 15, 20 factions that can do really well whenever it's not playing those 4, but there's really 4 that are head and shoulders above everything else. The core book is kind of the same way. People tend not to play just we're going to roll a die based on the core book anymore. But people were doing that in the early in last September, last October, last November. People were doing that. And uh, it's pretty idiosyncratic as well. Anytime you have all these missions that don't score until the end of the game, that obviously massively favors the things that are still surviving at the end of that game. And so I would say we also know with really less high certainty. We really have a lot of certainty about what's good in just the core book. Now, I don't think we've explored all the nooks and crannies, though, of the meta. I don't think we really have a great sense of like what is definitively good when tournament organizers are mix and matching missions from the core book and the Rumble Pack. There's a lot of variance there that I think is kind of unexplored. There's a lot of unplayed concepts. There are entire factions that just no one has taken to a tournament. Slanesh Demons has only been taken to a tournament once in, at this point, it's almost a year. There's been, man, I've got like almost 2,500 recorded competitive games between the first half and second half of this year for second edition so far. And man, Slanesh Demons is like, there's a few factions that just like have not been played. And some of those factions actually have some pretty interesting fighters in them and interesting approaches that you can take. And they're just not explored at all, right? So I don't think the community can legitimately say, like, we've tried everything and we're out of ideas now. Like, there's a lot that we haven't tried. And so for more varied battle packs, I actually think there's a ton of this meta that's completely unexplored. I mean, we know a lot of broad strokes, but there's a lot of unexplored stuff going on. And when you're at that point, I think there's also a lot of risk of unintentional consequences. In general, I think the best Warcry players are not nearly as good at Warcry as, say, the best Magic players are at Magic, or the best 40k players are at 40k. Because I mean someone who makes a living based on their reputation for winning. You have that in 40k, you have that in Magic, and so there's people who just understand the game in a way that I don't understand Warcry the way a lot of Magic pros understand Magic, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Other people like me who make content for you, we understand Warcry really, really well, but we don't understand it the way, Paulo Vitor understands Magic, or uh, blanking on any 40k pro players, but I've like met a few of these guys, and they understand 40k better than I understand Warcry, in my opinion. And for an example of that, I did not call that massively nerfing monsters was also going to massively nerf Stormcast. Now, I did know that the Rumble Pack would massively nerf Stormcast because they're not as good at spread out objective missions. But Stormcast were just like dominating monsters and being really, really good in my casual games in sort of a variety of different missions. But I really underestimated how much taking monsters out of the meta and the pressure that monsters put on various warbands, really underestimated how much that was going to hurt Stormcast competitively. Now, a couple Stormcast chambers are still pretty good, but I know that the people who would be writing the GW packs are seeing less data than what I'm seeing. So I would expect there's a lot of what they don't see coming. So when I think about whether we want updates to this game, I think about, how heavy a hand do we want our updates to be? The other thing about kind of balancing this game is that GW hasn't even really decided what a Warcry game is supposed to look like, which is an odd thing to say about a game that's existed for 4 years, but it's true. So, for example, Kill Team is all objective based. all of their sort of competitive battle plans, they're all based on scoring objectives, and everything is balanced around that idea. Uh, Warcry, I think, is essentially unplayable in an all objective environment. To go back to 2 slides ago, maybe 1 slide ago, whoops, we just know what's good too much to possibly, like, at this point, you can't, as a tournament organizer, give people a battle pack with all 4 matches being objective games. It's just untenable. Even going 3-1, I think, is untenable. Just the community just knows too much, and so part of that is because Kill Team is balanced to be an objective control game, right? Warcry is not balanced to be a objective control game, right? The current balance that exists was probably made for a combination of the core book matched play missions and the cards that they gave you in Heart of Gur. And, those were very sort of end of game attrition based things. There were some objectives like no quarter, which I don't love as a mission, but which sort of revolves around like getting to every part of the battlefield, things like that. Just lots of different things that made them feel like they wanted to balance the points in a certain way, and that's how it was played, right? It's clearly that's not how it's done, but the thing about that is that so the core book was kind of built a certain way that way, right? With these 2 treasure missions, for example, and other objective missions that only scored at the end of the game. And you contrast that with, say, the expansion cards that have come out since, which are incredibly varied and completely different from those core book missions that came out a year ago, and contrasting those with the Rumble Pack, which is all objective missions. All 3 of those sort of create completely different incentives for what your warband is supposed to look like. And the fact is, you can't balance for all of these. Unless, the point is that you can't balance for all of these, right? You could potentially balance for an expectation that people are going to mix and match from each of these, but you cannot balance for, because these missions favor such completely different things in the game, you just can't balance for people who are going to only play the game one way, which is really tough because I think low investment players generally play the game one way, right? Like if you just bought Sundered Fate and that was your box and that was the only way you play, and like you and your buddies, you bought Sundered Fate, you split it, and then you each bought one more warband, and so it's like you've got 2 warbands. You're playing Sundered Fate, you're playing the 3 matched play and the 3 narrative missions from Sundered Fate, and that's just how you're playing Warcry, right? The game's not balanced for you at all, right? There's going to be some warbands that are just crushing other warbands really, really badly because of, the fact that you're only playing the game one way, and right now I think the game's balance just doesn't handle people playing the same type of mission over and over and over. So all of this is to say that I kind of have a little bit of a skeptical eye towards how GW would actually balance the game until they kind of decide what they want missions to look like, what they want a Warcry mission to look like. And personally, I think it should be a variance. But they clearly don't really believe that. They've kind of generally made one kind of mission, like each battle pack essentially has just been like all one thing for the last few times, right? And so that's really going to change how they would want to come in and balance the game. Do we want them even to come and balance the game when they haven't even really decided what this should be? The last thing is kind of the negative experiences that happen both when you do and when you don't balance the game. One is the first thing, when you make a really big balance pass, when you change a lot, you invalidate certain people's lists. This is not as big an issue in Warcry as it is in Big Hammer, right? Because we have a much smaller painting meta, but it is still really annoying. And by painting meta, I mean the time it takes to take a sort of warband from I just built this to now I'm going to play it in a tournament. That obviously takes way more time in Big Hammer. If you kind of invalidate an interaction in Big Hammer, sometimes it's like they've got to paint 1,500 points because only 500 points of what they've got is gonna make it in. Whereas in sort of Warcry, sometimes you only have to paint one or two models to sort of make up for that. But it's still annoying and it kind of screws over certain types of players. It just isn't a great sort of feel good thing. Now, how annoying it is really different for event players versus kind of at home casual play. For example, if I'm going to events a lot, I don't mind my list being invalidated from time to time. In fact, I would be upset if they never got invalidated, but I would also be upset if they got invalidated a lot because I don't want to have to chase the meta. I want to be able to work hard on a warband and then play it in at least 2 or 3 different tournaments before I have to kind of change it up. But then when you do make the changes, if you don't change a lot, if you don't invalidate people's lists, that can be really frustrating too. Because if I'm going to tournaments and I'm just noticing that tournaments are kind of getting stale in a certain way, the same types of lists being good every single time, and then GW comes in and they just make a really bare bones change. If they, maybe change 5 points here, 5 points there, and that's it. That can be really frustrating for players because it gives the impression that they're not taking competitive issues seriously. They're not actually stopping the really broken things from happening. And I think people complain a lot. You see a ton of internet people always complain if the touch is too light on certain really busted stuff. The problem is the low investment players really hate the opposite, where if you feel like every 6 months my whole warband is being thrown into a blender and I can't do anything, well, that sucks, right? That's an awful feeling to have. And if you only paint, say, 1 or 2 warbands a whole year, which I think is a lot of people are in that boat, that's really, really rough. If twice a year GW is kind of throwing all your stuff in a blender and you only paint twice a year, that can be a really awful situation. So I think all of this is kind of worth considering when we talk about, wanting updates, wanting balance updates from GW, is that it's not just something that you can just go in and do. Now, I will say, if we're going to get kind of fun here, the real balance problem that I think that Warcry has right now is this linear pointing algorithm. Every time they've done a balance pass, now there's only been 3 points updates, but every single time it's really clear that they calculate how much everything should cost based on each stat is worth a certain amount for each increment up of that stat. And it's really, really awful because a point of movement, how valuable that point of movement is, completely depends on the chassis that you are moving. So, for example, really expensive fast models are way better than cheap fast models right now because of that. Or so, really fast flyers are only good if they are really tiny or really huge right now, for example. Things like that. That's a kind of recipe for disaster if you make points updates with a linear pointing algorithm, because players are going to find, there are going to be inefficiencies, and the inefficiencies are always going to be in one place if you do that. And so those types of updates just don't last as long. If you sort of make a more holistic update when you do update the game, then you don't need to update it as often because it takes a lot longer to figure out what's good. So, all of that said, I just gave a ton of reasons why I don't think GW should necessarily update the game right now as far as a points pass. However, most of that is because I don't necessarily trust them to have the information that's required. I spent, a few different slides talking about how they have a lot less information than we, the community, do because we actually track these tournaments and they do not. So, I can tell you that there are 7 steps, and that's all it would take to balance the current edition of Warcry with a couple assumptions. The first assumption is that we're stuck with the models we've got. The second assumption is that we will use a wide variety of the missions that are available to us in any given tournament. I am not saying that the steps that I've got here would be balanced for something that was all objective missions. Now, I could balance the game with all objective missions. I'll give you that. I think I could do it. But why would you want to? You'd be losing out on like 2/3 of the really fun mission types in Warcry. So that would be my assumption for these. But there are just 7 things that are just off no matter what spread of missions you're playing. That are just kind of skewed in the game right now that I think could be fixed with a pretty light touch that wouldn't ruin a lot of people's days. So I am going to be coming back Wednesday with a video about these 7 steps. The first one, fixing the slow baby horror show. I will tell you what slow babies are about. The second one is the interaction tax. And this is not something I talked about in a lot of videos, but I think it's a really serious issue. Well, not serious issue. It's a serious issue competitively in the game. And it's not a serious issue in people's casual games because people just don't play the fighters that are that are involved in the interaction tax. Secondly, what is a buff worth? Saving elves, poor elves. 5 is the counter question, and I think I've got a lot on that. That's I've ranted about counter really quickly on this show a couple times, but I've never really dove into it. 6 is cavalry confusion, and 7 is the mid-range trap. And if you just addressed these 7 things, most of them only would require changing the points on like a dozen or so fighters. Now, that sounds like a lot, a dozen times 7, but there's like 1,500 or more now because of Underworlds. There's a lot of fighters in Warcry, right? These would really only require changing a few, and it would change the game enough to, I think, put us in a more interesting place and also not throw everyone's warbands in a blender. So for my next video, I will be expanding on these 7 steps, and until then, may all your rolls be crits.